Hope everyone's doing well, keeping up with the material. We'll have some more reading about neoliberalism and globalization shortly. I hope everyone made it through Frantz Fanon and his arguments about the wretched of the earth, and this lecture should deepen some of the ideas that Fanon expresses. So first I want to start with a very general understanding about colonialism and how people receive colonialism in a psychological sense. So three just generic features of colonialism / imperialism that you'll find in all colonial instances. The first thing to notice, or the first feature, is that colonialism by definition tends to be coercive and violent, right? So in other words, imperialism or colonialism, I'm going to use those words interchangeably in this video lecture, by the way. But essentially, when one society colonizes or has an imperial relationship with another society, it does so with the use of force and with the use of coercion. In other words, if you resist, you are punished in a kind of physical, material way. So almost by definition, all instances of colonialism tend to be coercive. Right. Now that also plays into another major feature of colonialism, and that tends to be that it is exploitative. In other words, the whole purpose of one society using armed force to subjugate another society is to extract resources of one form or another. Oftentimes, throughout most of history, that has been done through the use of paying tribute. So if I were to create a colonial relationship or an imperial relationship with another society through force, I would then extract taxes or tribute, and you would just pay me in either material, surplus, or money if that was in existence, and that would be the extent of the relationship. So again, colonialism tends to be coercive and violent, and it tends to be exploitative. And you can just put those two features together and notice that it also, logically speaking, would have a psychological effect. It would tend to be humiliating for those societies that essentially are exploited and coerced by another society. So the psychological effect is one of humiliation for societies that have a colonial relationship with some other society or country that has more force, more coercive power than it, and reaps most of the rewards of that colonial relationship. Human societies, by the way, have engaged in that kind of coercive, exploitative, humiliating relationship for hundreds and thousands of years. And there's nothing particularly new about that. If you read one of the best histories, I highly recommend it if you ever get a chance to read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. He talks pretty openly about the Athenian subjugation of a small island of Melos. And it was pretty clear that that relationship was built on force and that there was an exploitation of the subjugated population. So I won't go into any further depth right now about that. I may come back to Thucydides in a minute. So that's the basic feature. I want to make, though, a more general claim, and that is that Western colonialism was qualitatively different than all other forms of historical colonialism / imperialism. So what makes it qualitatively different? What makes it different is the immense power disparity that emerges between the Western colonial powers and those societies that it subjugated. And you can guess, and if you've looked at the lecture notes, you can understand what the reason essentially is, and that is the Industrial Revolution allowed for a much greater amassing of power on the part of Western European and moving forward North American societies relative to those more traditional forms of political organization, political societies. And that immense power disparity has specific kinds of psychological effects that I wanted to detail. The first is that when you're subjugated by such an overwhelming power, there is a sense of, in a way, hatred of that power. After all, the relationship, as we suggested just a minute ago, is coercive and violent, it's exploitative, and it's humiliating. But it's really, to such an extent, there's virtually no hope. So there's a degree of hatred for, of course, being in that relationship. in and of itself, I don't think that that particular psychological effect of Western colonialism is any newer or any different than any other form of colonialism that has existed throughout human history. Almost all colonial societies will feel that sense of hatred for for a colonial power, and that goes along just with that sense of humiliation. But along with that sense of hatred, it comes along another kind of interesting psychological response that you wouldn't necessarily predict, and that's a sense of awe. So at the one time, or in the one instance, you hate this power, but on the other hand, you're kind of in awe of it, and part of that has to do with that immense power disparity again. It's so far removed from your reality that you could possibly resist that power, that you're in some sense in awe of it at the same time. So that's kind of an interesting psychological response. You hate it, but you're in awe of it. And then I'm going to couple that with one other psychological response, which is the response to want to copy it. Again, I don't know that we would naturally think about all of these psychological responses coming together, but it makes sense when you explain it and start to think about it a little bit deeper. If one country is so much power, one society is so much more powerful than another one, you might want to be, or you might be in awe of it, but you're going to want to copy it in part because you want that power too, so that again you're not humiliated and coerced by that society and exploited by it. So now we've got this psychological reaction of hatred, awe, and a sense of I'll use the word mimesis, but what I mean by that is copying. We want to copy that power. So that's a kind of interesting mix of psychological responses. I want to give you just one example of this, and bear with me here. I'm going to divulge something. I happen to be from Utah, and I grew up watching the Utah Jazz, so I'll throw it out there. And I enjoy John Stockton and Karl Malone, and I hated Michael Jordan. I absolutely hated him. So I know this is probably too young for most of you to have seen the NBA Finals with the Utah Jazz and the Chicago Bulls, but Michael Jordan could single-handedly take over a game. He had so much skill that he was really at a different level than other players. The immense power disparity was in play during the Chicago Bulls Utah Jazz series, and actually, by the way, the Seattle Sonics, when they were still in town, they played the Chicago Bulls too, and Michael Jordan did the same thing to the Seattle Sonics. So I really I hate Michael Jordan. I'm in awe of him, and I'm in awe of what he can do on a basketball court, or what he could do. The guy was truly phenomenal, and so you almost had to be in awe of him, even if he wasn't on your team, even if you, in a way, hated what he could do to your team that you were rooting for. And then, of course, that didn't mean that I didn't want to go copy Michael Jordan and be Michael Jordan on the basketball court. Of course, I didn't really have anywhere near those skills to think that I was going to be a basketball player. But everybody wanted to sort of be like Mike, and you go down to the gym and everybody's trying to be like the latest basketball star, and you still see that, of course. It's just a part of what we are as human beings. We do tend to copy things that are successful, or copy things that we see as models and as role models for us. So I hope you kind of picked up that point in some of the material we covered last week, that we tend to be conformist, highly conformist. And one of the reasons we conform is that we tend to copy the things that we find successful. And I'm even being a little bit overly instrumental in that. We copy the things that we're used to and that we get socialized into, regardless of whether or not it's actually successful. We'll almost always identify whatever's in existence as successful because that's what we're used to, that's what we're socialized into. So hopefully that makes sense. There's one other feature, though, of Western colonialism that helps really to fully understand, I think, Frantz Fanon. And that is there's a large amount of hypocrisy in Western colonialism. And by hypocrisy, what I mean by that is that the way in which ideologically Western colonialism was justified was perceived by those that were subjugated to Western power as hypocritical, in the sense that the values and the ideology, the content of those values and ideology, were completely at odds with the actual practice. So what was the ideology? The ideology, in short, was that the Western countries were colonizing backward traditional societies in order to civilize them, in order to bring them, in fact, universal values of freedom and equality. Obviously, that freedom and equality came at the point of a gun. In other words, you resisted, you died. And if you were a member of as Fanon calls it, the native society, you knew full well that you didn't have equal rights. You had to carry around your card. If you didn't obey the colonial rules, you would be punished and harmed in a very clear way. So if you're someone that experiences that colonialism from that angle, from the sense that this is a hypocritical system, they come in here saying that they're about universal values and individual rights, when in fact that's not what it's about, at least in your lived experience, then you start to have not just a hatred of that colonial power, but in fact deep resentment and even rage towards that colonial power. And that's a key psychological legacy that still exists to this day. And I hope that you follow through with the following lecture here about why Frantz Fanon is still relevant to this very day, and really think about how it explains, in some ways, the 9/11 attacks, the continued resentment, if you will, of the Western world. And it's not because those societies, as George Bush used to say, hate us for our freedom. They hate us for our legacy of colonialism and that sense of hypocrisy. As Fanon describes it, really the hatred emerges, or it evolves into resentment and rage because the sense of powerlessness, and with that, again, that immense power disparity, to act against that hypocrisy, to do anything about it, it kind of festers inside, and you just want to tear it apart. You want to get inside it and somehow rip it to shreds. As Fanon says, right, whenever he hears Western values, he wants to reach for his knife. So give that some thought, think it through, and read Fanon pretty carefully. He's got some pretty good insight in terms of how people are receiving this if you're on the other side of things. By the way, just in passing, the book The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon was widely regarded in the United States as well, particularly by Black Panthers and so on. So I think it explains a lot of the experience of marginalized populations in the United States. I'll probably raise that issue again in the very last week of the class. All right, hope you're all doing well. Email me if you have any questions. Bye.